Leaders from BC's municipalities and First Nations repeated their demands today that Premier David Eby back down from his legislation to fast-track private building projects, calling it flawed and undemocratic. For more, let's check in with Rob Shaw at the BC Legislature tonight. Rob, tell us more about what the arguments are here.
Well, Stacey, the Union of BC Municipalities and the First Nations Leadership Council just blasting government today in a joint event, saying it has to withdraw Bill 15 legislation that it says will undercut environmental approvals, roll back Indigenous rights, and is an unfair consolidation of power for the Premier and his cabinet. That issue of Bill 15, basically it would let cabinet designate private projects, let's say a mine or a mill or an industrial plant, that it feels are in the provincial interest, and push it through the environmental assessment and permitting process using cabinet's own rules. The government says mainly it wants to use this for schools and hospitals, but it does leave that door open to picking and choosing special private projects by politicians. The legislation was not crafted with Indigenous input, as is required, and municipalities say it overrides their local approvals too. Here's some of that press conference today.
In rushing the legislation through quickly and by standing behind it so aggressively, the province has failed to generate support and trust from local governments and from First Nations. In fact, I believe that this bill is eroding public trust.
Our chiefs are frustrated, they're upset, and they feel betrayed. But we can, at one swipe of the pen, the Premier can put all of this off to the fall, and that's what we're calling for, to kill the bill.
Premier David Eby again refusing to budge today, saying that even though he's met with Indigenous leaders and heard their concerns, he is going to pass this legislation and prove to them that it is in their best interests. Here he is today.
I think we're going to have to prove it. I understand the history of the provincial government and why the words fast track would cause so much concern among Indigenous leadership. But I also had a very positive meeting with the Modern Treaty Nations and engagement with them on this. We're engaging with Indigenous leadership on major projects across the province. And I think and I hope we'll be able to get to a point of demonstrating that this bill not only benefits the province as a whole, it benefits Indigenous communities as well.
One of the examples the Premier using today, Greater Victoria's sewage treatment fiasco, that 2-decade-long running controversy with Mr. Floaty and all of that, saying this kind of legislation would just push something like that through. That's an interesting example, Stacey, but what seems to be shaping up next is court action and protests from First Nations leaders on this, with a lot of warnings that if the government pushes this through next week, things are going to get much more difficult for it in the future.